Hi, I'm Elaine Engelhardt from Utah Valley State. This course is Ethics and Values, and we've been moving right along, and now we're talking about environmental ethics. Helping us with today's episode on Peter Singer is Dr. Pierre Lamarche. Glad you're here with us, Pierre. And over here we have Dennis Potter. It's terrific having two faculty members with us to discuss this article. And the students helping us out are Lloyd and Cassie, and over here Luke and Rhonda. So thank you so much for being here with us. And Rhonda, what can you tell us about Peter Singer?
Well, this is one of the philosophers that's still living.
Yes.
He was born in 1946 in Melbourne, Australia. He was the Ira W. DeCamp Professor of Bioethics at Princeton University. Mm-hmm. His parents were Viennese Jews who escaped to Australia in 1938. His father imported tea and coffee while his mother practiced medicine. I found that a little interesting. He received a degree in 1967 after studying law, history, and philosophy at the University of Melbourne. And his thesis at that time was entitled, "Why Should I Be Moral?" He is a kind of an interesting fellow. He also served on 2 occasions as chair of philosophy at Monash University, and founded its Center for Human Bioethics. And in 1996, he unsuccessfully ran as a Green candidate for the Australian Senate. He's best known for his book Animal Liberation, which is widely regarded as the touchstone of the animal liberation movement, and he is a founding member of the Great Ape Project.
Okay.
Okay.
Some great information there, and in fact our reading today comes from that text. He's a pretty controversial guy, isn't he, Dennis?
Yeah, when they wanted to appoint him as the chair of bioethics at Princeton University, there were quite a bit of protests from the conservative Christian right. People were not happy about that appointment, but nevertheless Princeton stuck to their guns, and he was appointed chair of bioethics, and he was one of the most qualified people, I think, in the world to be in that position. Okay,
and do you want to tell us just a little bit about this reading and the book from which it came?
Yeah, the book Animal Liberation, which was written in the 70s, I believe, in essence, sort of inaugurated the animal rights movement, and is still seen by many to be kind of the Bible of the animal rights movement. And it's a fairly well argued but yet also approachable book. It's not very technical philosophically, but yet there are many good arguments in favor of his positions. It's a very challenging book to read for those of us living in a world where we eat a lot of meat and wear animal skins as clothing.
It's enough to make you go vegetarian for at least a month.
Yeah. It is a challenging book, that is for sure.
It is. It's a challenging book. How do your students deal with this reading or this topic, Pierre?
Again, as Dennis has suggested, they find the arguments that Singer puts forward to be very intrinsically powerful and moving, and during any discussion in class where we're looking at issues that Singer has raised, animal liberation is one. Of course, he has other different concerns in the area of moral and ethical philosophy. Generally, the students react very strongly to the positions that he puts forward and find them very challenging.
And I think it's what ethics classes are all about.
Absolutely.
Having these very strong positions and being able to, if you don't agree, defend your point of view on why you don't agree, other than saying, well, I don't like it just cause. Well, let's go ahead and start looking at this reading, and we have some quotes, and I'll have the students read them and talk a little bit about them, and then have try to keep Dennis and Pierre from arguing too much with one another on this subject. I'm just teasing about that. They both know this very well. So Cassie, could I have you read the first quote for us, please?
Sure. Extending equality to animals. If we have learned anything from the liberation movements, we should have learned how difficult it is to be aware of the latent prejudice in our attitude to particular groups until this prejudice is forcefully pointed out.
And that quote's continued, please.
A liberation movement demands an expansion of our moral horizons and an extension or reinterpretation of the basic moral principle of equality. I am urging that we extend to other species the basic principle of equality that most of us recognize should be extended to all members of our own species.
Okay, so Lloyd, this one's yours to tell us a little bit about. Does he really mean that?
Yeah, he definitely does.
It's the thesis, isn't
yeah,
it?
and he basically points out that throughout history, every time there's been a liberation movement, whether it's a racial movement or whatever, it's always been pointed at a certain group and kind of excluded to that certain group instead of spreading it out. And so he's saying that's what we've done. We got to continue spreading it out even more.
Okay, and he just has, he says, gee, you know, look, you've looked at different races, you've looked at different religions, you've looked at gender. Why haven't you looked at animals? So why haven't we looked at animals?
Well, it's a very powerful point that he's making here, and again, it's basically an observation concerning the history of human ethical moral development. Throughout the course of history, we all know that different times, different places, human beings have not granted moral consideration, let alone rights, to vast categories of their own species. Women, people who are considered to be lower classes, slave classes, etc. And the notion that Singer is playing upon here is that during the course of the development of moral and ethical thinking, we have continuously expanded the boundaries of those individuals that we take into moral consideration, and there's no reason to suspect that we should not continue to do that.
Okay, thank you. So, Dennis, what seems to be so very controversial about this sentence, this thesis?
Well, I think what's controversial about it is the idea that somehow there's a moral analogy between racism and sexism on the one hand and speciesism on the other. Namely that, go ahead.
I was just going to say, can I tell you a phone call that I got just 2 days ago from a student who said, I don't get Peter Singer. Is he saying that if there's a baby and a cat in the road, that it's okay to hit either of them? I'll let you give an answer to that.
Well, I mean, obviously, you should avoid both of them if you can. But if you're forced, they both have equal consideration. They should both be taken into account equally. So the interests of, but of course, you have to take into account the impact of the death of either of them on others as well. And I think that, you know, most often that's going to, in a case like that, it's going to favor the human being because of the fact that human beings have very strong familial relationships that maybe don't exist to the same extent among animals. Nevertheless, you have to take it, what's important here is not that we can't treat animals and human beings differently ever. It's that we have to take into account animals' interests and weigh them equally with the interests that human beings have when we're trying to decide how to behave at a collective level or even at an individual level.
Thank you. It's great to have two of the most brilliant people in the philosophy department in the state and in the country even discussing this issue. So thank you for your comments. And how does this tie in with utilitarianism? So we see him as a utilitarian, and how's he going to tie his argument in with that?
Yeah, Singer, again, one of the most foremost representatives of that particular flavor of ethical theory, utilitarianism. And the basic notion behind utilitarian moral philosophy is the notion that our primary duty, our fundamental duty, is to act in ways that promote happiness and that, most significantly for this particular article, minimize pain and suffering. And hence, this being the basic moral duty that we have, Singer believes that as a result of this, one of the things that's entailed by this duty is the notion that we must take into equal consideration, moral consideration, any being that is capable of suffering.
Okay, thank you. And so it seems like we find the most extreme position that could be given on any of these arguments, and that's something that a student will present to us. I love that kind of challenge too, but I think it can often be answered with utilitarianism and the pain and pleasure.
Elaine, can I make a comment about that?
You bet.
I think behind utilitarianism is a view of human nature, which emphasizes more what humans have in common with animals rather than what makes them different from animals. Kant's ethical theory emphasizes rationality quite a bit, but for utilitarianism, what matters is sentience. And sentience is something that we have in common with animals. So once utilitarians started thinking in the vein of feeling is what matters, and we want to try to maximize good feelings, then it was a natural outgrowth of utilitarianism to include animals in that, because they're sentient as well. They feel as well, or at least we now believe that. There was a time at which some philosophers would have advocated the idea that animals couldn't feel, but I think hardly anyone believes that anymore. And so it's a natural extension, and that's what makes the analogy, is the fact that we're both sentient, both human beings and animals.
And that's the one word where he seems to get himself in trouble, doesn't he, with sentient? Good argument, but it's troublesome to some folks as to where it is with animals, with people, with different...
It's troublesome for what it seems to entail if you take your arguments to, their logical conclusion. It seems to me that most of us would think that it's pretty uncontroversial that there's something wrong with causing any being needless suffering. But once Singer gets you to accept that view, that there's something wrong with causing undue suffering to any creature that is capable of suffering, he can go a long way with that argument, and that's where the trouble begins, of course.
And it does. But I think they're fun discussions, very fun discussions. And Luke, let me have you read the next graphic for us, and then we'll have Rhonda tell us a little bit about it.
Okay. Men and women are similar beings and should have equal rights, while humans and non-humans are different and should not have equal rights.
And let's have you go on to the next graphic as well.
There are important differences between humans and other animals, and these differences must give rise to some differences in the rights that each have. Recognizing this obvious fact, however, is no barrier to the case of extending the basic principle of equality to non-human animals.
Okay, so Rhonda, do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I have a little bit of a... I don't agree with this.
That's just fine. You tell us.
I do believe that animals are capable of feeling.
You've got a great dog.
I have a wonderful dog, and she talks to me through her eyes and her body, and I can tell what's happening there. And I don't, if I step on her foot, I know that I've hurt her. I'm not so sure that when I step on a mosquito, that I've hurt it. So there are lines here that seem to be bigger than others. The distance between them. I don't think that hurting or inflicting pain for the fun of it, isn't something that we as human beings should do. But are we equal? No, I don't think so.
What do you think about that? Are you going to go along with Rhonda or oppose it, Luke?
I think I'll go along with her.
Okay.
I was reading this last night while I was eating a portion of a pig, and I paused for a minute and then I kept eating. First of all, I don't agree with utilitarianism much. I don't have much tolerance for it. But I think that I don't agree with the argument that if something is sentient, then it has the same rights as something else that is sentient. There are degrees of sentience. There are also other factors to be weighed. So I really disagree with Singer's argument.
Okay.
Can
Luke,
I say something in response? Is that okay?
You sure can. Go right ahead, Dennis.
One thing that's important with Singer, and we might be reading a quote later on this, is that he's not arguing that we are, in fact, equal with respect to our abilities and so on. But of course, human beings aren't equal with respect to their abilities. There's probably some apes that are more intelligent and able to perform more complicated tasks than some human beings. Certain human beings who have severe mental retardation, but of course we wouldn't want to accord them less rights as a result of having that. They wouldn't have the same interest because they're unable to do some things that other people are able to do, and of course it would be absurd to say that, for example, that a dog would have the interest to vote, because it's not going to have that interest. But they do have interests, and the principle of equality here is that we take those interests into equal account with our interests, and the interests may be different, but the principle of equality is not that we're the same as them. It's that we ought to take the interests into equal account when we're trying to decide how to treat them. And notice, it's one thing. I mean, if you say that it's wrong to harm animals just for fun, well, then it seems like that carries over. Well, eating is fun. You don't have to eat meat to be nourished. And so it seems like when you're eating an animal and you're killing it in order to eat it, you're harming an animal just for fun. The argument starts to follow.
Well, so under what circumstances then is it okay to kill an animal, say a beef, a cow?
For Singer, it would be similar circumstances. The circumstances would have to be analogous to circumstances where it's okay to kill human beings. And of course,
Right.
utilitarians acknowledge that that's sometimes okay. If you're going to save more lives, then it's okay to kill some.
Okay, Lloyd or Cassie, do you want to jump in on this argument?
I think it's been going pretty good so far, so I'll just
Okay.
wait until there's a lot more to go through. So.
Any concluding thoughts on this, or should we just move on?
Well, yeah, in response to what Luke was arguing earlier on, for Singer's got a bedrock foundation that he's always going to return to, and he's going to argue, I don't care if you don't like utilitarian theory, answer me this one question. Do you think that it is wrong to cause suffering that is unnecessary? And if your answer to that question is yes, I think it is wrong to cause unnecessary suffering, he can go a long way with that, and he might just have you.
And he does go a long way with it, yeah. Let's go ahead and pull up our next quote. Thank you, I enjoyed that dialogue. And would you read this for us, Lloyd?
Sure. The extension of the basic principle of equality from one group to another does not imply that we must treat both groups in exactly the same manner or grant exactly the same rights to both groups. Whether we should do so will depend on the nature of the members of the two groups. The basic principle of equality is equality of consideration, and equal consideration for different beings may lead to different treatment and different rights.
So tell us a little bit about that, Lloyd, and then we'll have Cassie tell us what she thinks.
It's kind of what we discussed before, where just because we have to look at is the equality, what he calls equality of consideration. And so everyone's not going to be the same. All beings aren't going to be the same. All animals aren't going to be the same. And so, but each one has different considerations. And so that's the equality, like Dennis brought up. Not a dog may not want to vote. And so you don't have to talk about the rights of a dog to vote, but a dog, most will agree, doesn't want to suffer, doesn't want to be hurt. And so that is the right you have to consider.
All right, good response. Cassie?
Yeah, I think it just goes along with what Dennis was saying, taking the interests, although they're not equal, into account for each of them and weighing those equally.
Okay, thank you. And I think also remembering this point in utilitarianism that Pierre brings up about that we've got this bedrock. Can you cause unnecessary suffering? Is that acceptable? And it's going to kind of undergird many of these statements. Anything you'd like to add to these comments then, Pierre?
Yeah, again, just the main point with regard to this graphic is the notion that human beings have very different interests, and yet we consider all human beings equally from a moral standpoint, and simply because animals have a different set of interests to human beings, that does not mean that they should not be granted equal moral consideration.
Okay, so these notions of dogness and catness, that we can't really quite make it to those levels, but should they have this then, Dennis? Should they have these?
Well, yeah, I think Singer's making a very good argument that they should. I think he's also responding in part to an argument that they shouldn't, namely that the difference between human beings and animals is the degree of intelligence. But of course, that same argument was used for racist positions. During when in the United States when we had slaves, the argument was often that African Americans were just not as intelligent, and so that was the place for them in society, is to be slaves. And that argument obviously doesn't work there. It doesn't work even if we wouldn't use IQ tests, for example, to determine whether or not someone should vote. We wouldn't, at least now, we wouldn't do that. We wouldn't use IQ tests to determine how many rights people should have. And so the differences in intelligence between human beings is not given moral importance. If that's the case, then that means the difference in intelligence between human beings and animals should not be given moral importance.
Okay, thank you. Once again, a very fundamental position of Singer's. So let's continue on. And Luke, would you read this next graphic for us?
We must face the fact that humans come in different shapes and sizes. They come with different moral capacities, differing intellectual abilities, differing amounts of benevolent feeling and sensitivity to the needs of others. differing abilities to communicate effectively, and differing capacities to experience pain and pleasure.
And it's continued.
In short, if the demand for equality were based on the actual equality of human beings, we would have to stop demanding equality.
Okay, so can you tell me a little bit about this, Luke?
He's just basically making the argument that, if you look at us, we're not all equal. We don't all look alike. We don't have the same abilities. We're gifted in different areas. So equality isn't based on real equality. It's based on the fact that, well, a lot of what we've been saying, that we have interests, that we have desires, and that they should be respected equally.
Okay, thank you. Anyone want to add to this point then? We've been covering it quite well, so let's move on to the next one. And Cassie, would you read this for us, please?
Sure. Equality is a moral ideal, not a simple assertion of fact. The principle of equality of human beings is not a description of an alleged actual equality among humans. It is a prescription of how we should treat humans.
Okay, Dennis, can you tell us a little bit about that? Equality is not a moral ideal. It's a simple assertion of fact, and it's not it's a prescription of how we should treat humans.
Yeah, I think there's a difference between asserting that we are in fact equal in some maybe metaphysical sense, we have the same capacities, or we have the same characteristics or features, and asserting that we ought to be treated equally, which is a prescriptive claim and not a descriptive claim. And so the difference, the problem that we sometimes have is we say, well, obviously animals aren't equal with human beings. We mean that in the descriptive sense, but Peter Singer means that in the prescriptive sense. He means that we ought to treat them equally, even though in fact descriptively we're not equal. We are equal with them, or we are analogous to animals in the most important way, and that is that we can suffer. And they can suffer, and if you grant this principle that Pierre was talking about, which is much less than a full-blown utilitarian theory, namely just that we shouldn't cause needless suffering. Once you grant that, it's really hard not to follow Peter Singer's argument down the line and say, well, we should get rid of factory farms, we should quit wearing animal skins, and we should quit eating them. Okay, and that's absolutely where the argument continues. Anything you'd like to add to this quote, then?
I think Dennis has done a fine job.
He has, hasn't he?
Discussing this graphic.
Thank you very much, Pierre.
Well, Lloyd, would you read the next graphic for us, please?
Sure. Difference of intelligence. If possessing a higher intelligence does not entitle one human to use another for his own ends, how can it entitle humans to exploit non-humans?
Okay, and let's just go ahead and read the next graphic and see what they say. The next two graphics, actually, Lloyd.
Can they suffer? The question is not, can they reason? No. Can they talk, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? The capacity for suffering and enjoying things is a prerequisite for having interests at all, a condition that must be satisfied before we can speak of interest in any meaningful way. If a being suffers, there can be no moral justification for refusing to take that suffering into consideration. No matter what the nature of the being, the principle of equality requires that its suffering be counted with the like suffering or of any other being. If a being is not capable of suffering or of experiencing enjoyment or happiness, there is nothing to be taken into account.
Okay, so Rhonda, what do you think about that?
I agree. I don't think that that any animal or human, within that group of people and animals, should have to suffer. And we have laws that will penalize people for hurting, their animals, which I think is justified.
Okay, and Luke, are you getting caught now?
No, not really.
You're not, okay.
I don't feel like I'm being caught either.
Okay, all right.
I think, you have to look at the reverse of this argument, which would be if something can't suffer, then you can do whatever you want to it. So if I can, I don't know what all the implications of that are, but if I can genetically engineer a human being with no pain receptors, can I do whatever I want to him? Or if you have, anything along those lines, if you have somebody who cannot feel pain or does so in a limited capacity, is there more of a free rein to experiment on them or kill them and so forth?
All right.
Well, that's not actually entailed by the utilitarian position. The utilitarian position basically says, here's a trait, sentience. If you have this trait, then you must be taken into moral consideration. That's not to say that does not entail that there aren't other traits that may grant an entity moral consideration as well.
So Pierre's using this word moral consideration. Dennis, what does it mean?
Well, someone is the object of moral consideration just in case you could do something wrong or right to them. So maybe, you know, inanimate objects like rocks might not be objects of moral consideration because, you know, I just do whatever I want with the rock and I'm not going to be doing something wrong. But an infant who maybe couldn't make moral decisions is very often going to be a subject of moral consideration because I could do wrong things to an infant. I could cause an infant, I could torture an infant and cause it to suffer. And I think that would be, if it was needless, it would be wrong from the utilitarian point of view. Another way to make the point that Pierre was making in response to Luke is that the capacity to suffer is a sufficient condition to be an object of moral consideration, but it's not a necessary one. There might be other things that we would consider. I mean, we might have androids in the future that are intelligent, and we might decide that intelligence, we might think that intelligence counts enough, even though they're unable to feel.
Okay, thank you. And Lloyd?
That's a question for Pierre and Dennis and Elaine or everyone else. With Mill's utilitarianism, where there's a gradation or certain levels of happiness, you know, with the whole pig satisfied and Socrates unsatisfied and whatnot, if happiness, if a human, because of their intelligence, can receive a higher level of happiness, say from eating a piece of steak or a piece of meat, can that happiness for Singer, or at least Mills, be a certain high enough that it overcomes the pain and suffering that is inflicted on the animal?
Do you want to tell us your thoughts on that, Pierre?
Yeah, you know, I don't know what, perhaps Dennis knows. Do you know what Mill's actual position with regard to the whole issue of animal liberation was?
I actually don't know Mill's position. I know Bentham's position. In fact, actually, Singer is quoting Bentham. Part of the quote that we read actually comes from Bentham. And Bentham realized that down the line, his view was going to have to entail a view of animal rights. But to answer your question more specifically, I think in principle it is possible. From a utilitarian point of view, in principle, if you get enough satisfaction out of eating a steak, that satisfaction has to outweigh the lack of life that the cow that had to die in order for you to eat that steak. So in principle, morally, it could happen, but the problem is, the fact of the matter is that it's not going to. The fact of the matter is that the enjoyment you get from eating steak is not going to outweigh the whole life of a cow, which is going to entail a lot of feeling throughout that life.
Okay, good question. Pierre?
Yeah, I think this is a good point where we can introduce what the real target of Singer's argument is here, which is basically the factory farming system that we find in highly advanced, industrialized nations. And if you take a good close look at what goes on factory farms, whether it's raising pigs or chickens or
cattle,
what have you, there's a very strong argument to be made that the conditions under which these animals are raised and slaughtered constitutes torture. It's the same sort of thing as taking a cat out into the middle of the street and setting it on fire, or something like that. And this is the real target, this level of suffering that is involved in the factory farming system in industrialized nations. This is his target. And the obvious response is, again, the pleasure that you experience eating a strip of bacon is not going to come anywhere near to balancing out the suffering that is inflicted on these animals in the current system that we have for raising livestock.
Okay, thank you. And in fact, Cassie, do you want to add anything to that for us, please?
No, I think I'll pass.
Okay. Maybe we can turn to page 40 in our supplemental readers, where it talks about this very point that he's bringing up. And Cassie, maybe I'll have you go ahead and read that for us. It's the very first column, and it's basically the first paragraph that starts out experimenting on animals.
Experimenting on animals and eating their flesh are perhaps the two major forms of speciesism in our society. By comparison, the third and last form of speciesism is so minor as to be insignificant, but it is perhaps of some special interest to those for whom this paper was written. I am referring to the speciesism in contemporary philosophy.
Okay, thanks. So that's one major point that he's making, and I'd like to go back a page as well, page 39, first column. And here is also where he describes for us then this farming production. And Luke, could you read for us where it starts out? It's not merely the act of killing.
Mm-hmm. It is not merely the act of killing that indicates what we are ready to do to other species in order to gratify our tastes. The suffering we inflict on the animals while they are alive is perhaps an even clearer indication of our speciesism than the fact that we are prepared to kill them.
And if you could skip down about 3 sentences and then start out with animals are treated like machines.
Animals are treated like machines that convert fodder into flesh, and any innovation that results in a higher conversion ratio is liable to be adopted. As one authority on the subject has said, cruelty is acknowledged only when profitability ceases. So hens are crowded 4 or 5 to a cage with a floor area of 20 inches by 18 inches, or around the size of a single page of the New York Times. The cages have wire floors since this reduces cleaning costs. The wire is unsuitable for the hen's feet. The floors slope since this makes the eggs roll down for easy collection, although this makes it difficult for the hens to rest comfortably. In these conditions, all the birds' natural instincts are thwarted. They cannot stretch their wings fully, walk freely, dust bathe, scratch the ground, or build a nest.
Okay, thanks. So are these things necessary? So sometimes many have been brought up to think, so what? Is it necessary that the birds be able to stretch their wings fully, to walk, dust, bathe, scratch the ground, Pierre?
Well, again, the bedrock question that Singer is going to ask at this point is the question of whether or not the extraordinary amount of suffering that is clearly being inflicted upon animals, chickens, cattle, pigs, during the process of their production for food, should that be taken into moral consideration? His belief, of course, is that all suffering must be taken into equal consideration, and hence the conditions under which these animals are raised and slaughtered, which leads to absolutely unnecessary amounts of suffering being inflicted upon them, must be taken into moral consideration.
Okay, so we keep coming back to this notion of moral consideration, and a very important point in this topic. So, Dennis, when we're looking at this then, and we're seeing the suffering that goes on with these animals, whether it's the chickens, the next paragraph talks about pigs, are these things that most people would just rather not know about and go ahead and freely participate in eating beef and wearing leather and those kinds of things?
Well, I think that we have a myth in our head of the nice family farm where the animals that we're eating have lived these great lives, and then near the end of their lives they're in a very benevolent way they're killed and then we eat them. But I think that myth is mostly false. I think that especially with pigs and chickens, they're almost all of them are raised in factory farm environments. The ones that we're eating, a lot of the beef is, not all of it, but a lot of the beef is raised in that kind of situation as well. And notice, I mean, this is consistent with Singer, but it's going a little bit beyond what he says in the essay. But notice that the conditions in which they're raised actually make the meat less healthy for us anyway. They're given injections of antibiotics and in order to fatten them up and make the meat taste better because it has more fat in it, more saturated fat, which means that it's worse for us. One thing that's entailed by Singer's argument is that carnivorous societies from the past that didn't use factory farming but just hunted, like, for example, Native Americans, are actually acting in a more moral way towards animals than we are in our society. So if you hunt and eat deer meat, you are, from Peter Singer's point of view, more moral, although I think you're still doing something wrong from that point of view, more moral than if you go to McDonald's. So the hunter is more moral than the person who's going to McDonald's to get meat. So I think that's an important point to make, that even if you grant that it's okay to eat animals, you can't possibly think, if you accept this suffering principle, you can't possibly think that it's okay to eat the animals that are raised in our system. And by eating those, you're supporting that system.
Okay, thank you. Well, Cassie, we have a huge pork production plant here in the state of Utah. And let's say that perhaps this pork production plant is really feeding the economy well in the community where it's located as well as in the state, and that we're even going to get a huge donation from them for this institution. Now, could you say that we should stop eating pork, and particularly pork that you know comes from a factory source?
Well, with the utilitarian perspective, you'd have to look at the amount of happiness that was being created by the pork factory, the workers, the community, the economy. But with Peter Singer's main premise, we want to look at the suffering as well, and that's, I don't know, I guess, is there more suffering involved with the pigs in the pig factory, or would there be more suffering involved if that was taken away to the community? I'm sure there would be other ways of, boosting the economy in the community without the pig factory, and that would minimize the suffering. But that's something to consider.
Here's an analogy. What if there were a factory here producing chemical weapons of mass destruction, like like mustard gas bombs or something like that, and they were giving donation and they were boosting the economy and so on. From a utilitarian point of view, we obviously we do need to weigh the overall effect there, but the likelihood of that of our actual calculus coming out with the conclusion that it's okay to have a weapons factory here is very low, and I think it's similarly very low with factory farm industry, because the alternative is an industry where where our food production treats animals with equal consideration. I think we'd all be healthier, and I think that we could have an industry like that in which the economy would be just as healthy.
All right.
So I have a question. So
yeah,
what is the solution to the factory farm then? Like what you're saying, what specifically would that be? I mean, what is the ideal?
Well,
was it just complete vegetarianism?
For Singer, that's what it would be.
Okay.
That we can certainly live without killing animals and eating them. But there are others who would take a more moderate point of view, who would say, as long as it says that these are wild chickens, or
cage-free.
Free range. That's what it is. I considered free range being wild, and wild salmon, instead of salmon that's been grown in cages and things like that. So
that would be the more moderate.
So for some folks there is this moderate position, but for Singer it isn't.
For Singer personally, it's not, but I think for Singer, Singer's obviously a very intelligent man. He realizes that he's not going to change the entire world tomorrow. He's not going to change our culture tomorrow. I think his basic challenge to any individual, though, would be to ask yourself the question, when I purchase and consume products that I'm eating, or products in general, actually, what went into the production of this commodity that I'm buying? In this particular instance, he's talking about eating meat and eating animal products. Ask yourself the question, what exactly was involved in producing this nice steak that I'm tucking into? What was the suffering that was caused during the production of it? And then ask yourself the simple question whether or not you are comfortable with purchasing that particular product, purchasing the steak and eating it, knowing how it got to your table. And if you're not comfortable, then perhaps you shouldn't buy it.
I think, most people choose not to think about it. But
I should point out too that being the consequentialist that he is, Singer is not going to be absolutist about ethics. He's not going to say it's absolutely wrong to kill an animal and eat it. Under some circumstances, it would be justified. For example, people who are living in pre-industrial societies where it's now winter time, they don't have any crops or any berries or nuts to pick, and all they've got are buffalo around. In order to survive, they're going to have to eat the buffalo. In those kinds of cases, his argument entails that you could probably justify killing and eating an animal in those cases. Of course, our society, we've gotten past that point. At least most of the industrial world, the developed world, has gotten past that point.
And like quite often with our environmental theorists, they're going to say, vote with your pocketbooks. So are there ways that we vote with our pocketbooks, and is that effective?
I think we, as a society, we almost always vote with our pocketbooks. Or I guess we vote with our pocketbooks in mind, not necessarily how we spend our money. And so it's difficult. You know, that's the way you can say, well, if nobody stops buying meat, then things will change. But the sense of, unless a large amount of people are doing this, voting with your pocketbook, in this sense, maybe not the most effective way of changing things.
Okay. Any thoughts on this, Luke? Rhonda?
You know, I agree with Singer wholeheartedly on factory farming and a lot of the things he makes. I just think the reasoning is wrong that he arrives at it by. You know, you could make the same sort of arguments on the basis of, you know, it's simply not environmentally sustainable to eat meat. You know, we couldn't have the entire world eating the way Americans eat and, you know, have enough resources on the earth to provide that. It's simply not possible. And so you can come at the argument in a different way. And I agree with him, you know, that a chicken shouldn't be in a cage, but I think it's because that chicken has, you know, an intrinsic value based on its teleological worth, but not because of, you know, some measurement of suffering, because that could justify other things.
Okay, thanks. So, Rhonda, let's say that you're the chicken, you're the mass chicken farmer, and what are you going to say to Lloyd about your chickens and being able to support the economy of the town in which you live, and get chickens even out here to our Arby's and McDonald's and Wendy's?
Did you say that I was the chicken or the farmer?
The farmer. You own them all. You own cage after cage after cage with 5 to a cage.
What would I? Well, you know, I would ask him how his farm is run. You know, first of all, I would probably ask him, you know, do you inject your chickens with this or that, or how do I know that your chickens aren't going to have the bird flu virus, or, you know, whatever those things are. How do I justify all those things as far as shipping them to wherever they need to go, or even slaughtering them? You know, may have some pull in what he tells me.
Okay, so it's a legitimate way to make business, Pierre, to make money. It's a legitimate business, but why is perhaps it not a strong moral business?
Well, Singer will argue that it's simply not necessary for advanced industrialized nations to provide for their economic well-being by raising and slaughtering livestock. It is not necessary. And if it involves, therefore, the infliction of suffering, that is not necessary, because we don't need to be doing this. We don't need to be eating meat. We don't need to be raising livestock in order to provide economically for our towns and our states and our countries. Then it is wrong and it should be stopped.
Okay. Cassie has a question for us.
I was just going to say that I think a lot of the time with the factory farmers and they're, you know, supplying all the grocery stores or different, I don't know how it works, but they can offer, unfortunately, and this is what most people choose, like you were talking, people shopping with their pocket or voting with their pocketbook, they can provide cheaper product, and that's really what it comes down to, and it's unfortunate that that's the cheaper way, but.
Yeah, sort of truth in advertising point that I was trying to make a few minutes ago. Singer will say, well, we all like to have cheap t-shirts.
Right, but would you have one from a sweatshop?
Exactly.
Yeah,
if you knew how this cheap t-shirt got to the shelf of your local store, and if you knew that it involved a sweatshop and child labor, et cetera, would it still be important for you to have the cheapest product available? And hopefully the intuition is that no, it's wrong. And Singer would use the exact same intuition to argue against, in general, factory farming practices
But this
that
is
provide us with lots and lots of cheap meat.
This, I think, is exactly why voting with your pocketbook would not be enough. And I think that Singer would take some further steps, although I think he thinks that that's an important first step.
In the first instance, I think this is where he wants to go,
Yeah,
right?
but I think then the next step, because of the fact that the economic system that the factory farm industry is part of is one that doesn't recognize moral values. It only recognizes exchange value. It only recognizes what is profitable. And as long as you have a system that only recognizes what's profitable, only recognizes exchange value, then you will have a system that inherently does things that are immoral. And so people objecting to that isn't going to really change that very much. What you have to do is change the system itself.
Okay, and this is a point that I'd like to have some of the students respond. So these industries then will have lobbyists. They'll be talking to senators, congressmen, presidents, and trying to make sure that no harm comes to their huge economic structure. They're making a lot of money by having these factory farms. Why could it be seen as an immoral form of capitalism, Lloyd, or is it a moral form of capitalism?
I think the reason why it can be seen as an immoral form of capitalism is because in the long process, because people will act immorally in order to enforce the system. It's whether it goes to pressuring the members of Congress, because if a chicken farmer has his farm, he's going to want to vote and have people representing him that are going to support his business, and now obviously that district member or whatever is going to do whatever he can to keep his vote. And so he's going to be, whether or not he agrees or thinks it's completely immoral, he's going to be pushing to push legislation and whatnot that keeps that business going, to keep himself in office. And it's just a cycle that continues on. And whether it's in advertising or whatever, is in order to keep the costs down, so they can make more profit and whatnot, they're always going to be pushing. I mean, it's inevitable. They're going to be using immoral actions to keep that going.
All right. How about you, Luke? Can you give me a counter to Lloyd?
A counter to Lloyd?
Yeah,
I don't know about that.
You can't do it. Okay.
I think he's right, and I think that any industry that requires lobbying in order to survive, shouldn't exist, basically.
Wow, I think that's a whole new topic. So I'm going to move on to the next graphic, and it's a little redundant, but Rhonda, let's have you go ahead and read this for us.
Animals as food. In order to have meat on the table at a price that people can afford, our society tolerates methods of meat production that confine sentient animals in cramped, unsuitable conditions for the entire durations of their lives. Animals are treated like machines that convert fodder into flesh.
And it's continued twice.
Our practice of rearing and killing other animals in order to eat them is a clear instance of the sacrifice of the most important interests of other beings in order to satisfy trivial interests of our own. The decision to cease giving it that support may be difficult, but it is no more difficult than it would have been for a white Southerner to go against the traditions of his society and free his slaves. If we do not change our dietary habits, how can we censor those slaveholders who would not change their own way of living?
Okay, so Pierre, what would be an appropriate answer to that last question that Singer's asking us? So he brings us up to this point of the suffering and of the cruelty, and then he's going to make the analogy with the slaves. Is it a solid comment?
Well, this is a return to the initial notion that we looked at the very outset of the program today. Again, the notion that throughout the course of history, if you look at the development of moral and ethical thinking, the trend has always been to continuously expand the range of individuals that you take in moral consideration. And once again, this is a return to the main point. Once upon a time, in our culture, we did not take into really any moral consideration whatsoever human beings, simply because they were of a different color of skin. And hence, simply because animals, of course, are different from us in significant ways, this is not a reason for us not to take them into moral consideration.
Okay, thanks. And what do you think about that argument then, Cassie or Lloyd?
Well, I think it's pretty much been going on with what we've been saying this whole time, is that the only way to really look at these things is to consider all of those aspects. And going back to our very beginning, is that level of equal consideration. And if you're going to treat animals as food, if you're going to say, well, certain beings should, I'll say right here, it says, our practice of rearing and killing other animals in order to eat them is a clear instance of the sacrifice of the most important interests of other beings in order to satisfy trivial interests of our own. It's going back to the idea is, well, if you think it's okay to make other people suffer, other beings suffer, other humans suffer to satisfy your own needs, well, that's the exact same thing you're doing when you're killing animals for your own food, making them suffer for your own food, is you're making other beings suffer for your own gratification.
Okay, thank you. So, Rhonda, is it okay to make money in this way? I know I keep coming back to the capitalistic rationale, but it's going to be the biggest hurdle, because when you've got big moneyed interest coming up against arguments like this, the big moneyed interests will do a lot to make sure that arguments like this are seen as kind of kooky.
Oh, absolutely. And when you, on occasion, hear about certain large chains who don't treat their animals, particularly chickens, in ways that won't just hurt them. I think animals have feelings. But I don't know that I'm ready to give up a chicken. I like chicken. But I suppose I'd like to have it not suffer. Don't quit.
we don't like this either or, then, do we?
It's a difficult situation.
Yeah, okay.
Let me bring, we've been arguing now in favor of Singer quite a bit, and although I'm very sympathetic to him, I think that there are some arguments that could be made against Singer on this analogy.
Basically, I've been trying.
Basically what you want to do, I think, in order to argue against this, or to criticize Singer on this point, is find some characteristic, some feature of animals that is disanalogous with human beings that is also morally significant. Intelligence isn't going to work, probably, because of the fact that some human beings don't exhibit a significant amount of intelligence for various reasons. But maybe something else works. Maybe the idea that human beings can make moral decisions is what makes human beings worthy of moral consideration. In other words, we're moral subjects. We can do right and wrong things, and we don't think of animals that way. I mean, even our pets, we don't think necessarily, we might punish them for things that they do, but we're just trying to get them to change their behavior in the future. We don't think of them as being morally culpable or responsible for what they've done. And so that might be a relevant disanalogy. And it might be a criticism that some of our viewers have been thinking about during the program. However, the objection to the criticism, or the response to the criticism, is that there's a difference between being a moral subject and being the object of moral consideration, because infants are clearly not moral subjects in the way I've defined it. And so if you believe that I can do something wrong to an infant who's not a moral subject, who can't do something wrong or right, then that means that isn't going to be the relevant difference. Every time you try to find some disanalogy, it seems like the problem comes up that there's a subclass of human beings that share that property with animals.
Okay, one argument there. Do you want to make any counter to it, and then I'll tell you a little bit about a book that one of my students wrote.
Well, I'm going to offer another possible trait that might introduce a disanalogy between human beings and animals. And this is controversial, but here's one possibility: self-consciousness, self-awareness. Human beings are aware of their identity, they're aware of their life, their past, they look forward to a future. And in that sense, human beings have a very strong interest in continuing their life, and hence in not being killed. It's arguable, I think, that animals have an interest in not suffering. But they have no self-awareness and no self-consciousness, and therefore it doesn't make any sense to say that they have an interest in continuing to live. So you might be able to finesse an argument that, yes, for example, factory farming is wrong because it does constitute unnecessary torturing of animals. But, if you let them run in the fields, this sort of bucolic view that we sort of have of what farms are all about, that is unfortunately not true. But if you stick to, free-range, pasture-fed animals, and at the end of their life you very benevolently dispatch them, then you might be able to finesse an argument that is going to cause problems to Singer.
Okay. And, I think that probably what we have happen most likely in a capitalistic vein would be that Singer's argument is rejected altogether. An alumni, one of my former students, wrote a terrific book. He focused on a woman named Linda who worked in a factory chicken farm, and how this was a very good paying job for her, paid her benefits, she could support her parents who were both not doing well, and when it was finally closed down, she had to go work at a rope factory, which did not give her these kind of benefits, did not give her the standard of living that she was used to with her folks, and she was going to have to be giving up quite a bit. So she would say that maybe she's going through her own suffering, that working on chickens was a lot more profitable for her and gave her a better quality of life than working on ropes. But anyway, let's go ahead and read our last two graphics, and would you read these for us, Cassie?
Yes. It is significant that the problem of equality in moral and political philosophy is invariably formulated in terms of human equality.
Continued.
If equality is to be related to any actual characteristics of humans, these characteristics must be some lowest common denominator, pitched so low that no human lacks them. But then the philosopher comes up against the catch that any such set of characteristics, which covers all humans, will not be possessed only by humans.
And the last one, please.
In other words, it turns out that in the only sense in which we can truly say that all humans are equal, at least some members of other species are also equal. Equal, that is to say, to each other and to humans.
Okay, so this is the conclusion of his statement and also the conclusion of the class. Any last words for us, Pierre? You've got about 30 seconds, and then we'll have 30 seconds from Dennis.
I'm a little bit disappointed in Peter Singer, who's a brilliant philosopher, in making the statement, it is significant that the problem of equality in moral and political philosophy is invariably formulated in terms of human equality. That's not true. Kant, of course, is an example of somebody who explicitly rejected the notion that only human beings are moral agents. He explicitly makes the point that any rational being, human or other, has moral consideration and is a moral agent. But that's kind of beside the point, I'm sorry.
Dennis, Pierre just got the last word. We just ran out of time, but it's been so wonderful having you here with us today, and I'm glad you made such strong arguments earlier. And Pierre, it's just been a real pleasure having you here as well. Thanks to you students for your help, and we will continue on with environmental ethics. Thanks. Bye-bye.